3,000 years ago, the world was connected. Empires traded across open seas, letters crossed continents. The Hittites commanded armies no enemy could stop. Egypt ruled the ancient world from stone and gold. It was the most sophisticated age humanity had ever built. Then, within 50 years, it all vanished. Capitals burned, palaces fell silent, cities were abandoned. Fleets of unknown warriors descended from the sea. Droughts choked the harvests. Famines broke empires apart. The earth itself may have shaken civilizations into rubble. Every major power, every great city, gone simultaneously. No single cause has ever been proven. Not one. Only ruins remain. Only silence where empires once roared. The greatest mystery in human history has no answer. This is the story of the Bronze Age Collapse, and why the death of one interconnected world still speaks to our own. The Eastern Mediterranean, 1,200 years before the birth of Christ, a world of palace cities, bronze weapons, and trade routes stretching from Egypt to the Aegean. This is where civilization first learned to breathe. For nearly 5 centuries, the late Bronze Age had been something extraordinary. A connected world. Palaces traded grain for tin, tin for copper, copper for gold. Letters passed between kings who called each other brother. Ships moved through the sea like blood through veins, carrying the weight of empires. At its height, this world contained some of the most powerful states ever assembled. The Hittite Empire commanded Anatolia from its mountain capital, Hattusa. Egypt, under the New Kingdom pharaohs, ruled from the Nile Delta to the borders of Syria. The Mycenaean kingdoms held the Greek mainland in their grip, their warriors armored, their citadels built to outlast time itself. And then there was Ugarit, a port city on the Syrian coast. Not an empire, not a conqueror, but perhaps the most important city in the ancient world. Every trade route passed through it. Every language was spoken within its walls. Consider what it meant to be alive in that world. Consider what there was to lose. We know what this world looked like because it left things behind. Clay tablets pressed with cuneiform script, letters written in haste, administrative records listing cattle, oil, grain, a bureaucracy so thorough it recorded its own destruction. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE, every one of these civilizations collapsed. Not slowly, not gracefully. They fell. Hattusa was burned and abandoned. Mycenae was sacked. Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt. The Egyptian New Kingdom survived, but only barely, contracting, hollowing out, never again reaching what it had been. Within the span of a single lifetime, a world that had taken centuries to construct simply ceased to exist. The silence that followed lasted centuries. Writing disappeared from Greece for 400 years. Trade routes that had sustained millions of people vanished. Cities that had housed thousands were abandoned to weeds and wind. When the world began to remember itself again, it had forgotten almost everything that came before. Archaeologists working in the ruins of Ugarit found something that stopped them. In a kiln, unfired tablets, letters that had been written, sealed, and placed for baking, and never retrieved. The fire that baked them was not the kiln. It was the city itself, burning. One letter, written in the final days of Ugarit, has become the most haunting document of the ancient world. It is addressed to the king of Cyprus. The writer, the governor of Ugarit, describes enemy ships sighted offshore. He says his own fleet is away. He says he has no grain. He says he does not know what to do. There was no reply, or if there was, it never arrived. The question that has haunted historians for more than a century is deceptively simple. What happened? What force or forces could bring down not one civilization, not two, but every interconnected state across an entire region in less than 50 years? No single answer has ever been proven. That silence at the center of the question is, in itself, the most interesting thing about it. History is full of fallen empires. It is almost never full of fallen worlds. The first and most dramatic theory is the one that ancient sources themselves suggest: invasion. In Egyptian records, carved in stone at the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, there is a description of a catastrophe arriving from the sea. Peoples moving in great waves, destroying everything in their path. The Hittites, it says, were erased. No land could stand before them. Egyptologists have called them the Sea Peoples, a name assembled from fragments, from the names Egypt gave to the groups it encountered: the Peliset, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. Who they were, where they came from, whether they were a coordinated force or a convergence of displaced populations, none of this is known with certainty. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show them clearly: warriors in feathered headdresses, ox carts carrying women and children, a people on the move, not raiding, not conquering for tribute, but migrating, displacing, arriving with everything they owned and nowhere to return to. On the Nile Delta, Ramesses III met them in battle, on land and on the water simultaneously, in one of the largest military engagements the ancient world had ever seen. Ramesses III commanded his archers to line the shores. He positioned his warships in the Nile mouth, their prows facing the sea. When the Sea People's fleet entered the delta, the Egyptians released volleys of arrows so thick the sky darkened. The enemy ships were capsized, overwhelmed, their warriors dragged from the water and bound. Egypt held, diminished, and never again what it had been. But the Sea People's theory, compelling as it is, carries within it an unanswered question. If these migrants destroyed the Hittites, sacked the Levantine cities, and shook Egypt to its foundations, what destroyed them? Where did they come from? They could not have appeared from nothing. Something had already set the world in motion before they arrived. The soil remembers things that writing does not. Pollen cores extracted from lake beds across the eastern Mediterranean tell a story of prolonged drought beginning around 1200 BCE, harvests failing, rivers falling, the same land that had fed palace economies for centuries slowly becoming dust. Paleoclimatologists have reconstructed the pattern. A shift in the Mediterranean climate system, possibly triggered by changes in Atlantic circulation, brought a decades-long drought to the Levant, Anatolia, and Greece. Not a single bad year, not two, a generation of failed harvests, a generation of hunger. Hittite records from the years just before the collapse are full of desperate requests for grain. One letter from the Hittite king to the pharaoh pleads, "It is a matter of life and death. Send ships, send grain." The reply, if there was one, did not save them. Within years of that letter, Hattusa was burned, its storehouses emptied, its streets silent. The land had fed them for centuries. Then, quietly, it stopped. The drought theory fits much of the evidence, but it too has limits. Droughts had happened before. Civilizations had survived bad harvests, even bad decades. What was different this time? Why did systems that had endured for centuries prove so suddenly fragile? The answer, some scholars argue, lies not in any single catastrophe, but in the nature of the world itself. The late Bronze Age was the first globalized economy in human history. Its civilizations were not independent, they were interdependent. And interdependence, under sufficient stress, becomes something else. It becomes fragility. The Bronze Age depended on bronze. Bronze required copper and tin. Copper came primarily from Cyprus. Tin came from sources as distant as Afghanistan and possibly Britain. No single civilization controlled both. Every sword, every chariot wheel, every palace door hinge depended on a supply chain stretching across thousands of miles. When the Uluburun shipwreck was discovered off the coast of Turkey in 1982, it revealed the extraordinary complexity of that trade. A single late Bronze Age ship, sunk around 1300 BCE, carried 10 tons of copper ingots, 1 ton of tin, ebony logs from Africa, ivory from elephants and hippos, Canaanite amphorae of oil and wine, glass ingots from Egypt, scarabs, a golden scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti. It was not a merchant vessel. It was the world itself, floating. What happens when that world stops moving? Economist and historian Eric Klein has described the Bronze Age collapse as a systems collapse, the simultaneous failure of interconnected systems, each dependent on the others. Drought weakens agriculture. Weakened agriculture strains palace economies. Strained palace economies can no longer maintain armies or trade networks. Trade networks collapse. Tin stops arriving. Bronze production falls. Armies can no longer be armed. Cities can no longer be defended. Into that vacuum, that slow, grinding failure of everything at once, the Sea Peoples arrive, not as a cause of the collapse, as a consequence of it. Displaced themselves by drought and instability in the Aegean and Anatolia, they push further south and east, colliding with civilizations already weakened, already hollowed out. A final blow delivered to a world already dying. Every cause fed the next. There was no single fire, only the burning. There is a third theory, less dramatic in its imagery, but perhaps the most destabilizing of all: internal rebellion. The palace system of the late Bronze Age was built on extraction: grain from farmers, labor from craftsmen, loyalty from local rulers kept in line by gifts and threat. For centuries, the weight of that system had been held in balance. But balance is not stability, it is tension. As drought reduced harvests, palace administrators demanded the same tribute from populations with less to give. Taxes rose as yields fell. Farmers who could not pay fled to the margins, joining bands of displaced people the Egyptians called the Hapiru, outlaws, migrants, the dispossessed. In some regions, these groups grew large enough to threaten the cities themselves. The empire was not only being attacked from outside, it was being dissolved from within. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt in 1887, preserve the voices of vassal kings writing to the pharaoh with increasing desperation. They ask for troops. They ask for gold. They warn of enemies at their gates, enemies within their walls. They speak of betrayal, of cities changing hands, of the world becoming unfamiliar. One letter from the king of Byblos reads like a cry into silence. "My father sent me 20 words, and yet you have given me nothing. I am like a ship in the middle of the sea. The winds of the east and the west and the south and the north have struck me, and I am sinking." No one came. There is one more theory: earthquakes. The late 13th century BCE saw a significant cluster of seismic activity along the fault lines of the eastern Mediterranean. Evidence of earthquake destruction has been found at several Mycenaean sites, at Mycenae itself, at Tiryns, at Medea. The massive walls that had seemed so permanent showed cracking, subsidence, sudden abandonment. Archaeologist Amos Noor argued that a sequence of massive earthquakes struck the region in rapid succession. that the ground itself became unreliable just as the political world was becoming unstable. Walls built to hold armies could not hold the earth. Palaces that had survived a century of warfare collapsed in seconds, and a civilization that had already been weakened by drought, by trade disruption, by internal unrest, could not absorb the shock. The ground moved, everything else was already moving. What is remarkable, standing at a distance of 3,000 years, is not that any one of these theories exists. It is that all of them may be simultaneously true. Drought, systems collapse, invasion, internal revolt, earthquakes, none of them alone sufficient. All of them together, arriving within the same terrible decades, overwhelming every buffer, exhausting every reserve. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was burned somewhere around 1180 BCE. The city had been inhabited for 5 centuries. It covered more than 3 square kilometers. Its walls were among the most formidable ever built in the ancient world. When archaeologists excavated it, they found no bodies, no weapons, no signs of massacre, only ash, only emptiness. The population had left before the fire, or been driven out, and never returned, a city of tens of thousands of people, gone without a grave. Mycenae, the city of Agamemnon, the city that Homer remembered as rich in gold, was sacked and partially destroyed around 1200 BCE. Its famous Lion Gate still stands, but the palace behind it was burned. The administrative records, thousands of linear B tablets, were fired into permanence by the same flames that destroyed them. The Mycenaean world did not end in a single blow. It contracted over decades, site by site, palace by palace, until the writing simply stopped. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, vanished with the palaces that had maintained it. For 400 years, the Greek world was illiterate. When writing returned, it arrived in a new form, the Phoenician alphabet, adapted into what would become Classical Greek. The Greeks of the Classical Age had no memory of the Bronze Age world. Homer sang of it as a myth. Heinrich Schliemann, the 19th century archaeologist who excavated both Troy and Mycenae, believed he was uncovering the historical reality behind Homer's epics. In a sense, he was right, though the truth was stranger than the legend. What he found was not simply a war. He found the wreckage of an entire civilization, older than Greece itself, deeper than any Greek poet had imagined. We had been looking for a story. What we found was an absence. Egypt alone survived the collapse in any recognizable form, but survival was not victory. The new kingdom pharaohs of the 20th dynasty presided over a diminished world. The great building programs slowed. The tribute from foreign territories disappeared. The priesthood of Amun accumulated wealth and power the pharaoh could no longer contest. By 1070 BCE, Egypt had split. A country that had been unified for 1,000 years simply divided itself in two. Rameses III, in the final years of his reign, conducted a formal inquiry into corruption among the administrators of his own tomb complex. Officials who had stolen grain, withheld wages from the workers building his eternal monument. Even as he fought off the sea peoples on the Nile Delta, the empire was rotting at its foundations. He was eventually assassinated in a palace conspiracy organized by his own harem. The greatest military power on earth, brought down by its own household. What replaced the Bronze Age world? For centuries, almost nothing. Population declined sharply across the Aegean and the Levant. Trade contracted to local circuits. The great palace cities were replaced by small villages, then by abandoned tells, mounds of compressed ruin rising from the plain. The Iron Age that eventually followed was not a continuation. It was a different civilization, built by different people who had largely forgotten what came before. Iron is harder than bronze. Iron weapons were superior to bronze weapons. But the Iron Age did not begin because humanity chose better technology. It began because the Bronze Age supply chains, the copper from Cyprus, the tin from the edges of the known world, had collapsed. Iron was local. Iron was everywhere. Bronze required a world that no longer existed. They did not choose iron. They were left with it. The ruins of Ugarit have been excavated since the 1920s. Layer by layer, the city reveals itself. Its alphabetic script, one of the earliest true alphabets ever created, sits frozen in clay, waiting. The last tablets found in the kiln include administrative lists, a letter about grain shortages, and a text that scholars believe may be the world's oldest musical notation. Even at the end, someone was writing down music. It was never finished. The city ended before the song did. The Bronze Age collapse is not only an ancient story, it is a mirror. The world it describes, a globalized economy, interdependent systems, supply chains stretching across continents, civilizations too interconnected to fail and too fragile to survive, is a world that feels disturbingly familiar. Its lesson is not comforting. Complexity, pushed far enough, becomes its own vulnerability. The scholars who study this period are careful with their language. They speak of convergence, of cascading failures, of stress multipliers. They are very careful not to say that it could happen again, because they know that careful language cannot hold back what evidence implies. The distance of 3,000 years offers very little comfort. Across the ruins of the Bronze Age world, archaeologists continue to uncover fragments of what was lost. At Megiddo, in Israel, a cache of carved ivory, furniture inlays from the palace, survived beneath the rubble. At Tiryns, a fresco of a Mycenaean woman, her eyes still vivid, her expression unreadable. At Tel Abu Hawam, the warehouses of a destroyed port city, their storage jars still in place, still waiting for a shipment that never came. The Ventris decipherment of Linear B in 1952 was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century. Michael Ventris, an architect, not a classical scholar, cracked the script that had confounded the world for 50 years. What it revealed was not epic poetry, not mythology. Nautsurdi astans antoistriastits. Sheep, wheat, oil, bronze, the bookkeeping of a vanished world, preserved by accident in the fires of its destruction. We do not have their literature, we have their receipts. Archaeologist Eric Klein has spent decades studying the collapse. In his book, 1177 BC, he describes standing in the ruins of Megiddo, a city that was destroyed and rebuilt 26 times, and feeling the weight of what repetition means. These people kept building. They kept returning, not because they did not know what destruction looked like, but because they could not imagine any other life. That persistence is its own kind of evidence. The Bronze Age did not end because people gave up. It ended because the systems that sustained them failed faster than they could adapt. The cities that were rebuilt after the collapse were smaller, simpler, more local. They had learned something, or perhaps they had simply forgotten how to be large. There is something almost peaceful in simplification, something almost human. Some things survived. The Phoenician cities of the Levantine coast, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, endured the collapse better than most. Their trade networks contracted but did not vanish. Their alphabet, which had crystallized in Ugarit, spread west. Within 3 centuries, it had reached Greece. Within 5, it had reached the Italian peninsula. Without the Bronze Age collapse, there may have been no Phoenician alphabet. Without the Phoenician alphabet, no Greek. Without Greek, nothing else is possible. Destruction carries seeds it does not know it carries. The Iron Age civilizations that emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age collapse were not lesser than what came before. Greece, Persia, the Assyrian Empire, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Phoenician city-states, these were not diminished successors. They were something new, built on the ruins of the old world, shaped by its loss, haunted by legends of what had existed before. The Trojan War, the Flood, the Age of Heroes. Memory carried forward in forms that no longer knew what they were remembering. The Bronze Age collapse took approximately 50 years. The Dark Age it produced lasted approximately 400. By the time Greece emerged from that darkness into the light of the classical period, the palace civilization of Mycenae was so remote it was indistinguishable from myth. The Trojan War, if it happened, was a story told about a world its tellers could no longer see. 400 years, every generation entirely ignorant of the one before it. What strikes historians most deeply about the Bronze Age collapse is not the scale of the destruction, it is the completeness of the forgetting. Other civilizations have fallen and been mourned. Rome was mourned for centuries, but the Bronze Age world was not mourned. It was not even remembered. It simply disappeared from human consciousness, leaving only faint traces, a myth here, a place named there, until archaeology began, with enormous patience, to dig it back up. We did not know we had forgotten it. That is the most frightening part. In the ruins of Hattusa, archaeologists found the royal archives of the Hittite Empire, thousands of clay tablets, diplomatic correspondence, religious texts, law codes. They record a civilization of extraordinary sophistication, treaties negotiated in multiple languages, a concept of international law, a royal family connected by marriage to Egypt, to Babylon, to the Aegean. Everything the Hittites knew about themselves, written down and then forgotten completely for 3,000 years. They wrote everything down. It did not help them. The question of what caused the Bronze Age collapse will likely never be fully resolved. The evidence is fragmentary. The silences in the record are too large, too deep. What we can say is what the evidence shows: a world that was rich, connected, sophisticated, and confident in its own permanence. And then, silence. Ash. An unfinished letter in a kiln. A shipment of grain that never arrived. A song that was never completed. And the sea, indifferent, still moving. Every civilization that has ever existed has believed on some level that it would endure, that its walls were thick enough, that its harvests would come, that its gods were listening. The Bronze Age world was no different, and in that, perhaps, it is the most honest mirror we have ever been given, not of what we were, of what we are. The tablets are still being translated, the ruins are still being excavated, the silence is still speaking. Somewhere beneath the soil of the Eastern Mediterranean, there are stories we have not yet found. Letters written in the last hours of cities we cannot name. The names of people who lived through the worst decades in recorded history and somehow kept going. To the next valley, to the next harvest, to the next year. Their names are gone. Their children's names are gone. But the land holds them. It always does. The last diplomatic letter found at Ugarit ends mid-sentence. The scribe stopped writing. Whether because the enemy had arrived, or because the fire had reached the room, or simply because the day had run out of hours, we do not know. The sentence hangs open in the clay. An incomplete thought, pressed into permanence by catastrophe, waiting 3,000 years for someone to read it. We are still reading it. We have not yet understood it. We may never understand it. And still we read.